Section 7 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Malone. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2. Great Navigators of the 18th Century, by Jules Verne. First part, Chapter 2, Part 2. Captain Cook's Predecessors, to Sea. The trade wind was only met on the 16th, and the weather remained detestable. Above all, although Carteret navigated in the neighborhood of Danger Island, discovered in 1765 by Byron and by others, he saw no land. "We probably were close by land," he says, "which the fog prevented our seeing, for in these waters numbers of birds constantly flew round the ship." Commodore Byron, in his last voyage, had passed the northern limits of this portion of the ocean, in which the Solomon Islands are said to be situated, and, as I have been myself beyond the southern limit without seeing them, I have good reason for thinking that if these islands exist, they have been badly marked on all the charts. This last supposition is correct, but the Solomon Islands do exist, and Carteret stopped there a few days later without recognizing them. The victuals were now all but consumed or tainted, the rigging and the sails torn by the tempest, half the crew on the sick list, when a fresh alarm for the captain arose. A leak was reported just below the low water line. It was impossible to stop it, as long as they were in the open sea. By unexpected good fortune, land was seen on the morrow. Needless to say, what cries of delight, what acclamations followed this discovery. To use Carteret's own comparison, the feelings of surprise and comfort experienced by the crew can only be likened to those of a criminal, who at the last moment on the scaffold receives a reprieve. It was Nitendit Island, already discovered by Mendana. No sooner was the anchor cast than landing was hurried, in search of water supply. The natives were black, with woolly hair, and perfectly naked. They appeared upon the shore, but fled again before the boat could come up with them. The leader of the landing party described the country as wild, bristling with mountains and impenetrable forests of trees and shrubs, reaching to the shore itself, through which ran a fine current of fresh water. The following day the master was sent in search of an easier landing place, with orders to propitiate the natives, if possible, by presents. He was expressly enjoined not to expose himself to danger, to return if several pirogues advanced against him, not to leave the boat himself, and not to allow more than 2 men to land at once, whilst the remainder held themselves on the defensive. Carteret, at the same time, sent his ship's boat on shore for water. Some natives attacked it with arrows, which fortunately hit no one. Meantime the sloop regained the Swallow. The master had 3 arrows in his body, and half his crew were so dangerously wounded that 3 sailors and he himself died a few days later. This is what happened. Landing the 5th in succession in a spot where he had noticed huts, he entered into friendly traffic with the natives. The latter soon increased in numbers, and several large pirogues advanced towards his sloop, and he was unable to rejoin it until the very moment when the attack commenced. Pursued by the arrows of the natives, who waded up to their shoulders into the water, chased by pirogues, he only succeeded in escaping after having killed several natives and foundered one of their boats. This effort to find a more favorable spot where he might run the Swallow ashore having ended so unfortunately, Carteret heaved his ship down where he was, and efforts were made to stop the leak. If the carpenter, the only healthy man on board, did not succeed in perfectly stopping it, he at least considerably diminished it. Whilst a fresh landing for water was sought, the fire of the guns was directed upon the woods, as well as volleys of musketry from the sloop. Still the sailors worked for a quarter of an hour, when they were attacked by a shower of arrows, which grievously wounded one or two in the breast. The same measures were necessary each time they fetched water. At this juncture 30 of the crew became incapable of performing their duty. The master died of his wounds. Lieutenant Gower was very ill. Carteret himself, attacked by a bilious and inflammatory illness, was forced to keep his bed. These 3 were the only officers capable of navigating the Swallow to England, and they were on the point of succumbing. To stay the ravages of disease, it was necessary to procure provisions at all costs, and this was utterly impossible in this spot. Carteret weighed anchor on the 17th of August, after calling the island Egmont, in honor of the Lord of the Admiralty, and the bay where he had anchored Swallow. Although convinced that it was identical with the land named Santa Cruz by the Spaniards, the navigator nevertheless followed the prevailing mania of giving new appellations to all the places he visited. He then coasted the shore for a short distance, and ascertained that the population was large. He had many a crow to pick with the natives. These obstacles, and moreover the impossibility of procuring provisions, prevented Carteret's reconnoitring the other islands of this group, upon which he bestowed the name of Queen Charlotte. The inhabitants of Egmont Isle, he says, are extremely agile, active, and vigorous. They appear to live as well in water as on land, for they are continually jumping from their pirogues into the sea. One of the arrows which they sent passed through the planks of the boat, and dangerously wounded the officer at the poop in the thigh. Their arrows are tipped with stone, and we saw no metal of any kind in their possession. The country in general is covered with woods and mountains, and interspersed with a great number of valleys. On the 18th of August, 1767, Carteret left this group with the intention of regaining Great Britain. He fully expected to meet with an island on his passage, where he might be more fortunate, and on the 20th he actually did so, discovering a little low island which he named Gower, where cocoanuts were procurable. Next day he encountered Simpson and Carteret Islands, and a group of new islands which he took to be the Ohang Java, discovered by Tasman. Then successively Sir Charles Hardy and Winchelsea Islands, which he did not consider as belonging to the Solomon Archipelago, the island of St. John, so-called Schouten, and finally that of New Britain, which he gained on the 28th of August. Carteret coasted this island in search of a safe and convenient port, and stopped in various bays where he obtained water, wood, cocoa, nutmegs, aloes, sugar canes, bamboos, and palm cabbages. This cabbage, he says, is white, crisp, of a substance filled with sugar. Eaten raw, the flavor resembles that of a chestnut, and boiled it is superior to the best parsnip. We cut it into small strips and boiled it in the broth made from our cakes, and this broth, afterwards thickened with oatmeal, furnished us with a good meal. The wood was all alive with pigeons, turtle-doves, paroquets, and other unknown birds. The English visited several deserted huts. If an idea of the civilization of a people can be drawn from their dwellings, these islanders were on the lowest rung of the social ladder, for their huts were the most miserable Carteret had ever seen. The commander profited by his stay in this place, by once more overhauling the Swallow, and attending to the leak, which the carpenters doctored as well as they could. The sheathing was greatly worn, and the keel quite gnawed away by worms. They coated it with pitch and warm tar mixed together. On the 7th of September, Carteret accomplished the ridiculous ceremony of taking possession of the country in the name of George III. He then dispatched one of his boats upon a reconnoitring expedition, which returned with a quantity of cocoa and palm cabbages, most precious provision for the sick on board. In spite of the fact that the monsoon would soon blow from the east for a long time, Carteret, alive to the dilapidated condition of his ship, determined to start for Batavia, where he hoped to make up his crew and to repair the Swallow. Upon the 9th September, therefore, he left Carteret Harbor, the best which he had met with since leaving the Straits of Magellan. He soon penetrated to a gulf to which Dampier had given the name of St. George Bay, and was not long in reconnoitring for a strait which separated New Britain and New Ireland. This passage he found and named St. George. He describes it in his narrative with a care which should certainly have earned for him the thanks of all his contemporary navigators. He then followed the coast of New Ireland to its southern extremity. Near a little island which he named Sandwich, Carteret had some dealings with the natives. These natives, he says, are black, and have woolly hair like negroes, but they have not flat noses or large lips. We imagine them to be of the same race as the inhabitants of Egmont Island. Like them, they are entirely naked, if we accept some ornaments of shells, which they attach to their arms and legs. At the same time, they have adopted a fashion without which our fashionable men and women are not supposed to be perfectly dressed. They powder their hair, or rather the wool on their heads, white, from which it follows that the fashion of wearing powder is probably of greater antiquity and of more extended fashion than we would have generally supposed. They are armed with spears and large sticks in the shape of clubs, but we perceived neither bows nor arrows. At the southwestern extremity of New Ireland, Carteret found another land, to which he gave the name of New Hanover, and shortly afterwards the group of the Duke of Portland. Although all the portion of the narrative of his voyage, in countries unknown before his time, abounds in precious details, Carteret, a far more able and zealous navigator than his predecessors Byron and Wallace, makes excuses for not having collected more facts. The description of the country, he says, and of its productions and inhabitants, would have been far more complete and detailed had I not been so weakened and overcome by the illness to which I had succumbed through the duties which devolved upon me from want of officers. When I could scarcely drag myself along, I was obliged to take watch after watch, and to share in other labors with my lieutenant, who was also in a bad state of health. After leaving St. George's Strait, the route was westward. Carteret discovered several other islands, but illness for several days prevented his coming on deck, and therefore he could not determine their position. He named them Admiralty Islands, and after 2 attacks found himself forced to employ firearms to repulse the natives. He afterwards reconnoitred Duror and Matty Islands and the Quedes, whose inhabitants were quite delighted at receiving bits of an iron hoop. Carteret affirms that he might have bought all the productions of this country for a few iron instruments. Although they are the neighbors of New Guinea and of the groups they had just explored, these natives were not black, but copper-colored. They had very long black hair, regular features, and brilliantly white teeth. Of medium height, strong and active, They were cheerful and friendly, and came on board fearlessly. One of them even asked permission to accompany Carteret upon his voyage, and in spite of all the representations of his countrymen, and even of the captain, he refused to leave the Swallow. Carteret, meeting with so decided a will, consented, but the poor Indian, who had received the name of Joseph Freewill, soon faded away and died at Celebes. On the 29th October, the English reached the northeastern portion of Mindanao. Always on the lookout for fresh water and provisions, Carteret in vain looked for the bay which Dampier had spoken of as abounding in game. A little further off he found a watering place, but the hostile demonstrations of the inhabitants forced him to re-embark. After leaving Mindanao, the captain sailed for the Straits of Macassar, between the islands of Borneo and Celebes. They entered it on the 14th of November. The vessel then proceeded with so much difficulty that she only accomplished 28 leagues in 15 days. Ill, he says, weakened, dying, tortured by the sight of lands which we could not reach, exposed to tempests which we found it impossible to overcome, we were attacked by a pirate. The latter, hoping to find the English crew asleep, attacked the Swallow in the middle of the night. But far from allowing themselves to be cowed by this new danger, the sailors defended themselves with so much courage and skill that they succeeded in foundering the Malay prau. On the 12th of December, Carteret sorrowfully perceived that the western monsoon had commenced. The Swallow was in no condition to struggle against this wind and current to reach Batavia by the west. He must then content himself with gaining Macassar, then the principal colony of the Dutch in the Celebes Islands. When the English arrived, it was 35 weeks since they had left the Straits of Magellan. Anchor was scarcely cast when a Dutchman, sent by the governor, came on board the Swallow. He appeared much alarmed on finding that the vessel belonged to the English marine service. In the morning, therefore, when Carteret sent his lieutenant, Mr. Gower, to ask for access to the port in order to secure provisions for his dying crew, and to repair his dilapidated ship, and await the return of the monsoon, not only could he not obtain permission to land, but the Dutch hastened to collect their forces and arm their vessels. Finally, after 5 hours, the governor's reply was brought on board. It was a refusal couched in terms as little polite as they were equivocal. The English were simultaneously forbidden to land at any port under Dutch government. All Carteret's representations, his remarks upon the inhumanity of the refusal, even his hostile demonstrations, had no other result than the sale of a few provisions and permission to proceed to a small neighboring bay. He would find there, he was told, certain shelter from the monsoon, and might set up a hospital for his sick, that indeed he could procure more plentiful provisions than in Macassar, from whence they would send him all that he could need. Fearing death by starvation and foundering, it was necessary to overlook these exactions, and Carteret proceeded to the roadstead of Bonthane. There the sick, installed in a house, found themselves prohibited from going more than 30 roods from their hospital. They were kept under guard, and could not communicate with the natives. Lastly, they were forbidden to buy anything excepting through the agency of the Dutch soldiers, who strangely abused their power, often making more than 1,000% profit. All the complaints of the English were useless. They were forced to submit, during their stay, to a surveillance to the last degree humiliating. It was only on the 22nd of May, 1768, on the return of the monsoon, that Captain Carteret was able to leave Bonthien, after a long series of annoyances, vexations, and alarms, which it is impossible to give in detail, and which had sorely tried his patience. Celebes, he says, is the key to the Moluccas, or Spice Islands, which are necessarily under the power of the people who are masters of this island. The town of Macassar is built upon a promontory, and is watered by one or two rivers which cross it or flow in its vicinity. The ground is even and beautiful in appearance. There are many plantations and cocoa-nut woods, interspersed with houses, which convey the idea that it is well populated. At Bonthien the beef is excellent, but it is difficult to procure enough of it to feed a fleet. Fowls, and as much rice and fruits as can be wished, are procurable. The woods abound with wild pigs, which are to be had cheap, because the natives, being Mohammedans, do not eat them. These details, however incomplete, had great interest at the time they were collected, and we go so far as to believe that even now, some 100 years since they were first written, they yet contain a certain amount of truth. No incident marked the voyage to Batavia. After several delays, caused by the desire of the Dutch company to make Carteret give them a testimonial as to the treatment he had met with from the government of Macassar, and which he steadily refused, Carteret at last obtained permission to repair his vessel. On the 15th of December the Swallow, partially refitted, set sail. She was reinforced with a supplementary number of English sailors, without which it would have been impossible to regain Europe. 80 of her original crew were dead, and 80 more were so reduced that 7 of their number died before they reached the Cape. After a stay in this port, a most salutary one for the crew, which lasted until the 6th of January, 1769, Carteret set out once more, and a little beyond Ascension Island, at which he had touched, he met a French vessel. It was the frigate La Boudeuse, with which Bougainville had just been round the world. On the 20th of March the Swallow anchored in Spithead roadstead, after 31 months of a voyage as painful as it had been dangerous. All Carteret's nautical abilities, all his sang-froid, all his enthusiasm were needed to save so inefficient a vessel from destruction, and to make important discoveries, under which conditions, if the perils of the voyage add lustre to his renown, the shame of such a miserable equipment falls upon the English Admiralty, who, despising the representations of an able captain, risked his life and the lives of his crew upon so long a voyage. End of section 7. Recording by Malone. Section 8 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Malone. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2. Great Navigators of the 18th Century, by Jules Verne. First Part, Chapter 2, Part 3. Captain Cook's Predecessors, 3a. Bougainville, a notary's son metamorphosed, colonization of the Malouine Islands, Buenos Aires and Rio Janeiro, the Malouine relinquished to the Spaniards, hydrography of the Strait of Magellan, the Percherais, the Quatre Facardios, Tahiti, incidents of the stay there, productions of the country and manners of the inhabitants, Samoa Islands, the land of the Holy Spirit or the New Hebrides, the Louisiade, the Anchorite Isles, New Guinea, Bouton, from Batavia to St-Malo. Whilst Wallace completed his voyage round the world, and Carteret continued his long and hazardous circumnavigation, a fresh expedition was organized for the purpose of prosecuting new discoveries in the southern seas. Under the old regime, when all was arbitrary, titles, rank, and places were obtained by interest. It was therefore not surprising that a military officer, who left the army scarcely 4 years before with the rank of colonel, to enter the navy as a captain, should obtain this important command. Strangely enough, this singular measure was amply justified, thanks to the talents possessed by the favoured recipient. Louis-Antoine de Bougainville was born at Paris on the 13th of November, 1729. The son of a notary, he was destined for the bar, and was already an advocate. But having no taste for his father's profession, he devoted himself to the sciences, and published a treatise on the integral calculus, whilst he obtained a commission in the Black Musketeers. Of the 3 careers he thus entered upon, he entirely abandoned the first 2, slightly neglected the third, for the sake of a fourth, diplomacy, and finally left it entirely for a 5th, the naval service. He was destined to die a member of the Senate after a 6th metamorphosis. First aide-de-camp to Chevreuse, then secretary of the embassy in London, where he was made a member of the Royal Society, he left Brest in 1756 with the rank of captain of dragoons, to rejoin Montcalm in Canada. Becoming aide-de-camp to this general, he distinguished himself on various occasions, and obtained the confidence of his chief, who sent him to France to ask for reinforcements. That unhappy country was just then overwhelmed with reverses in Europe, and had need of all her resources. Therefore, when young Bougainville entered upon the object of his mission to M. de Choiseul, the minister answered brusquely, "When the house is on fire, one does not worry oneself about the stables." "At least," replied Bougainville, "no one can say that you speak like a horse." This sally was too witty and too stinging to conciliate the minister. Ultimately, Madame de Pompadour, who appreciated witty people, introduced Bougainville to the king, and although he did not succeed in obtaining much for his general, he gained a colony, and the order of St. Louis for himself, although he had only seen 7 years' service. Returning to Canada, he was anxious to justify Louis XIV's confidence, and distinguished himself in various matters. After the loss of his colony, he served in Germany under M. de Choiseul-Stainville. His military career was cut short by the peace of 1763. His active spirit and love of movement rebelled against a garrison life. He conceived the strange idea of colonizing the Falkland Islands in the extreme south of South America, and of conveying there, free of expense, the emigrants from Canada who had settled in France to escape the tyrannous yoke of England. Carried away by this idea, he addressed himself to certain privateers at St-Malo, who, from the commencement of the century, had been in the habit of visiting the group, and who had named them Malouine Islands. Having gained their confidence, Bougainville brought the advantages, however problematical, of this colony to the minister's notice, maintaining that the fortunate situation of the island would secure a good resting place for ships going to the southern seas. Having high interest, he obtained the authority he desired, and received his nomination as ship captain. It was the year 1763. There is little reason to suppose that marine officers who had passed all the grades of the service looked with gratification upon an appointment which no past event justified. But that mattered little to the Minister of Marine, M. de Choiseul-Stainville. Bougainville had served under him, and was far too grand a personage to trouble himself about the grumbling of ship's officers. Bougainville, having brought his uncle and cousin, Messieurs de Nerville and d'Arboulin, to look favourably upon his venture, caused the Eagle of 20 guns and the Sphinx of 12 to be built at St-Malo, under the auspices of Monsieur Guizot Duclos. Upon these he embarked several Canadian families. Leaving St-Malo on the 15th of September, 1763, he rested at St. Catherine's Island, on the coast of Brazil, and at Montevideo, where he took horses and cattle, and landed at the Malouine in a large bay, which appeared to him wholly suited to his purpose, but he was not long in discovering that what he had taken by preceding navigators for woods of moderate height were only reeds. Not a tree, not a shrub grew in the islands. Fortunately, an excellent turf did for fuel in their stead, whilst fish and game offered good resources. The colony consisted at first of only 29 persons, for whom huts were built and also a provision warehouse. At the same time a fort, capable of holding 14 guns, was planned and commenced. Monsieur de Nerville agreed to remain at the head of the establishment, whilst Bougainville returned to France on the 5th of April. There he recruited some more colonists, and took a considerable cargo of provisions of every kind, which he disembarked on the 5th of January, 1765. He then went to the Strait of Magellan in search of a cargo of wood, and having, as we have already narrated, met Commodore Byron's squadron, followed it to Port Famine. There he took in more than 10,000 saplings of different growths, which he intended to transport to the Malouine. When he left the group on the 27th of April following, the colony already numbered 80 persons, comprising a staff paid by the king. Towards the end of 1765, the same 2 vessels were sent back with provisions and new colonists. The colony was beginning to make a show, when the English settled themselves in Port Egmont, reconnoitred by Byron. At the same time, Captain Macbride attempted to obtain possession of the colony, on the ground that the island belonged to the English king, although Byron had not recognized the Malouine in 1765, and the French had then settled there 2 years. In the meantime, Spain laid claim to it in her turn, as a dependency of Southern America. England and France were equally adverse to a breach of the peace, for the sake of this archipelago, which was of so little commercial value, and Bougainville was forced to relinquish his undertaking, on condition that the Spanish government indemnified him for his expenses. In addition, he was ordered by the French government to facilitate the restoration of the Malouine to the Spanish commissioners. This foolish attempt at colonization was the origin and groundwork of Bougainville's good fortune, for in order to make use of the last equipment, the minister ordered Bougainville to return by the South Sea and to make discoveries. In the early days of November 1766, Bougainville repaired to Nantes, where his second-in-command, Monsieur Duclos Guyot, captain of the fireship, and an able and veteran sailor, who grew gray in the inferior rank because he was not noble, superintended the equipment of the frigate La Boudeuse of 26 guns. Bougainville left the roadstead of Minden at the mouth of the Loire on the 15th of November for La Plata River, where he hoped to find two Spanish vessels, the Esmeralda and the Liebre, but scarcely had the Boudeuse gained the open sea when a furious tempest arose. The frigate, the rigging of which was new, sustained such serious damages that it was necessary to put for repairs into Brest, which she entered on the 21st November. This experience sufficed to convince the captain that the Boudeuse was but little fitted for the voyage he had before him. He therefore had the masts shortened, and changed his artillery for less heavy pieces. But in spite of these modifications, the Boudeuse was not fit for the heavy seas and storms of Cape Horn. However, the rendezvous with the Spaniards was arranged, and Bougainville was obliged to put to sea. The staff of the frigate consisted of 11 officers and 3 volunteers, among whom was the Prince of Nassau-Siegen. The crew comprised 203 sailors, boys, and servants. As far as La Plata, the sea was calm enough to allow of Bougainville's making many observations on the currents, a frequent source of the errors made by navigators in their reckonings. On the 31st of January, La Boudeuse anchored in Montevideo Bay, where the 2 Spanish frigates had been awaiting her for a month, under the command of Don Felipe Perichis Puente. The long stay Bougainville made in this part, and also at Buenos Aires, enabled him to collect facts about the city and the manners of the inhabitants, which are too curious to be passed over in silence. Buenos Aires appeared to them too large for its population, which amounted only to 20,000. The reason being that the houses are of only 1 story, and have large courts or gardens. Not only has this town no fort, but it has not even a jetty. Thus ships are forced to discharge their cargoes on to lighters, which convey them to the little river, where carts come to take the bales and convey them to the town. The number of religious communities, both male and female, in Buenos Aires adds to the originality of its character. Bougainville says, "The year is full of saint days, which are celebrated by processions and fireworks. Religious ceremonies supply the place of theatres. The Jesuits incite the women to greater austerity in their piety than any other order. Attached to their convent they have an institution entitled Casa de los Ejercicios de las Mujeres, that is, House for the Devotion of Women. Women and girls, without the permission of husbands or fathers, enter the retreat for 12 days, to increase their sanctity." They were lodged and boarded at the expense of the company. No man ever set foot in this sanctuary unless in the cowl of St. Ignatius. Servants even of the female sex were not allowed to accompany their mistresses. The devotional services consisted of meditation, prayer, catechizings, confession, and flagellation. We were shown the stains on the walls of the chapel made by the blood which flowed under the hands of these Magdalens as they did penance. The environs of the town were well cultivated and brightened by a large number of country houses named cuentas, but scarcely 2 or at most 3 leagues from Buenos Aires were immense plains with scarcely a single undulation, given up to bulls and horses, which are almost the only inhabitants. Bougainville says, "These animals were so abundant that travelers, when they needed food, would kill a bull, consume what they could eat, and leave the rest to be devoured by wild dogs and tigers." The Spaniards had not yet succeeded in subduing the Indian tribes on the 2 shores of La Plata River. They were called Indios Bravos. They are of medium height, very ugly, and almost all infected with the itch. Their complexions are very dark, and the grease with which they perpetually rub themselves makes them even blacker. Their sole garment is the skin of the roebuck, which reaches to the heels, and in which they wrap themselves. These Indians pass their lives on horseback, at least near the Spanish settlement. They occasionally come there with their wives to buy eau de Cologne, and they never cease drinking until drunkenness literally deprives them of the power to move. Sometimes they assemble in droves of 200 or 300 to carry off the cattle from the Spanish lands, or to attack the caravans of travelers. They pillaged, massacred, and carried off slaves. It was an evil without remedy. How was it possible to subdue a wandering nation in a vast and uncultivated country, where it was difficult even to meet with them? Commerce was far from flourishing, as no European merchandise was allowed to pass by land to Peru or Chile. Nevertheless, Bougainville saw a vessel leaving Buenos Aires, carrying 1,000,000 piastres. "And if," adds he, "all the inhabitants of this country had the traffic of their hides in Europe, that of itself would be enough to enrich them." The anchorage of Montevideo was safe, although several times they were visited by pamperos, a scourge of the southwest, accompanied by violent tempests. The town offered nothing of interest. The environs are so uncultivated that it is necessary to import flour, biscuits, and everything necessary for the boats. But fruits, such as figs, peaches, apples, lemons, and so on, are plentiful, as well as the same quantity of butcher's meat as in the rest of the country. These documents, which are all 100 years old, are curious when compared with those furnished by contemporary navigators, especially by Monsieur Émile Dérault in his work on La Plata. In many respects this picture is still correct, but there are other details, such, for instance, as regards instruction, of which Bougainville could not speak as it did not exist, in which it has made immense progress. When the victuals, the provisions of water, and the cattle were embarked, the 3 vessels set sail on the 28th of February, 1767, for the Malouine. The voyage was not fortunate. Variable winds, heavy weather, and a running sea caused much damage to the Boudeuse. On the 23rd of March she cast anchor in French Bay, where she was joined on the morrow by 2 Spanish vessels, which had been much tried by the tempest. Upon the 1st of April the restitution of the colony to the Spaniards was solemnized. Very few French profited by their king's permission to remain in the Malouine. Almost all preferred to embark upon the Spanish frigates upon their leaving Montevideo. As for Bougainville, he was forced to await the provisions, which the fly-boat Étoile was to bring him, and which was to accompany him upon his voyage round the world. However, the months of March, April, and May passed, and no étoile appeared. It was impossible to cross the Pacific with only 6 months' provisions, which was all the Boudeuse carried. Bougainville decided at last, on the 2nd of June, to reach Rio Janeiro, which he had mentioned to M. de la Gironde, the commander of the Étoile, as a rendezvous, should unforeseen circumstances prevent his reaching the Malouine. The crossing was made with such favorable weather that only 18 days were needed to reach the Portuguese colony. The Étoile, which had been awaiting her for 4 days, had left France later than was expected. She had been forced to seek shelter from the tempest at Montevideo, from whence, following her instructions, she gained Rio. Well received by the Count of Acuna, Viceroy of Brazil, the French had opportunities of seeing the comedies of Metastasio given at the opera by a mulatto troupe, and of hearing the works of the great Italian masters executed by a bad orchestra, conducted by a deformed abbé in ecclesiastical dress. But the cordial relations with the Viceroy were not lasting. Bougainville, who, with the Viceroy's permission, had made some purchase, found the delivery of it refused for no reason. He was forbidden to take wood he needed from the royal timber yard, although he had concluded a contract for it. And lastly, he was prevented from lodging with his staff, during the repairs of the Boudeuse, in a house near the town, placed at his disposal by a friend. To avoid altercation, Bougainville hurried the preparations for departure. Before leaving the capital of Brazil, the French commander entered into various details of the beauty of the port and the picturesque nature of its surroundings, and finished by a very curious digression upon the prodigious riches of the country, of which the port was the emporium. The mines called General, he says, are the nearest to the town, although they are 75 leagues away from it. They yield the king a yearly revenue by his right to a 5th share of at least 112 arrobas of gold. In 1762 they brought him in 119. Under the captaincy of the general mines, those of the Rio de Mor, Sabara, and Cerro Frio were included. The last named, in addition to all the gold it produces, yields all the diamonds which come from the Brazils. No precious stones, except diamonds, are contraband. They belong to the speculators, who were obliged to keep an exact account of the diamonds they find, and to restore them to the possession of an intendant named by the king for this purpose. He immediately places them in a casket bound with iron, and fastened with 3 locks. He retains 1 key, the king has another, and the proveedor de Hacienda Real the 3rd. This casket is enclosed in a second, stamped with the seals of 3 persons named, and containing the 3 keys of the smaller one. But in spite of all these precautions, and the severe punishment visited upon diamond robberies, an enormous contraband trade was carried on. It was, however, not the only source of revenue, and Bougainville calculated that, deducting the maintenance of troops, the pay of the civil officers, and all the expenses of the administration, the King of Portugal drew no less than 10 million francs from the Brazils. From Rio to Montevideo no incident occurred, but upon the Plata, during a storm, the Étoile was run down by a Spanish vessel, which broke her bowsprit, her beakhead, and much of her rigging. The damages and the shock increased the leak of the ship, and forced her to return to Ensenada de Barragan, where the repairs were more easily managed than at Montevideo. It was impossible, therefore, to leave the river until the 14th of November. 13 days later, both ships came in sight of Virgin Cape at the entrance to the Strait of Magellan, which they hastened to enter. Possession Bay, the first they met with, is a large space open to all winds and offering very bad anchorage. From Virgin Cape to Orange Cape is about 15 leagues, and the strait is throughout 7 or 8 leagues wide. The first narrow entrance was easily passed, an anchor cast in Bucco Bay, where half a score of officers and men landed. They soon made acquaintance with the Patagonians and exchanged a few trifles, precious to the natives, for swansdown and guanaco skins. The inhabitants were tall, but none of them reached 6 feet. What struck me as gigantic in their proportions, says Bougainville, was their enormous breadth of shoulder, the size of their heads, and the thickness of their limbs. They are robust and well nourished, their muscles are sinewy, their flesh firm, and in fact they are men who, having lived in the open air and drawn their nourishment from juicy aliments, have reached their highest point of development. The distance from the first to the second opening may have been 6 or 7 leagues, and was passed without accident. This opening is only 1½ leagues in width and 4 in length. In this part of the strait the ships easily reconnoitred St. Bartholomew and St. Elizabeth Islands. At the latter the French landed. They found neither wood nor water. It was an absolutely desert land. Leaving this place, the American side of the strait is amply furnished with wood, but although the first advances had been fortunate, Bougainville was to find plenty to try his patience. The distinctive character of the climate lies in the rapid atmospheric changes, which succeeded each other so quickly that it is quite impossible to forecast their sudden and dangerous variations. Hence the damages which it is impossible to foresee, which retard the passage of the ships, even if they do not force them to seek shelter for repairs. Guillaume-Duclos Bay provides an excellent anchorage, with 6 or 8 fathoms of water and sound bottom. Bougainville remained there long enough to fill several casks, and endeavoured to procure fresh meat, but he only met with a few wild animals. St. Anne's Point was reached. At that place Sarmiento had founded the colony of Philippeville in 1581. In a preceding volume we have narrated the fearful catastrophe which procured the name of Port Famine for this spot. The French reconnoitred several bays, capes, and harbors, at which they touched. They were Bougainville Bay, where the Étoile was repainted, Port Beaubassin, Cormadière Bay, off the coast of Tierra del Fuego, and Cape Forward, which forms the most southerly point of the strait and of Patagonia, Cascade Bay in Tierra del Fuego, the safety, easy anchorage, and facilities for procuring water and food of which render it a most desirable haven for navigators. The various ports which Bougainville discovered are particularly valuable, as they offer favorable points for doubling Cape Forward, one of the most difficult routes for sailors on account of the violent and contrary winds which prevail there. The year 1768 opened for the adventurers in Fort Rescue Bay, below which is Port Gallant, the plan of which had been taken with great exactitude by Monsieur de Gênes. Detestable weather, of which the worst winter in Paris can give no idea, detained the French expedition for 3 weeks. It was visited by a band of Pacheans, the inhabitants of Tierra del Fuego, who boarded the ship. We made them sing, says the narrative, dance, listen to instruments, and above all, eat. Everything was pleasant to them, bread, salt meat, tallow. They devoured everything that was given them. They showed no surprise either at the sight of the vessels or that of the various objects which were shown to them, no doubt because to feel surprise at works of art one must have elementary ideas. These men, akin to brutes, treated chefs-d'œuvre of human industry as they treated the laws and phenomena of nature. These savages are small, ugly, thin, and smell abominably. They were all but naked, having only clothing of sealskin too small to cover them. These women are hideous, and the men appear to care little for them. They live all together, men and women and children, in one hut, in the center of which a fire is lighted. Their food is chiefly shellfish. Still they have dogs and snares set with whalebone. On the whole, they appear to be a good sort of people, but so weak that one overlooks their faults. Of all savages I have met with, the Pecherais are the most destitute. A painful event occurred whilst the crew were in this port. A child of about 12 years of age came on board, and glass beads and bits of glass were given to it, with no suspicion of the use to which they would be put. It would appear that these savages are in the habit of stuffing pieces of talc down the throats as talismans. This boy no doubt meant to do the same with the glass, for when they landed they found him vomiting violently and spitting blood. His throat and gums were lacerated and bleeding. In spite of the enchantments and violent rubbings of a juggler, or perhaps on account of this not too effective treatment, the poor child suffered dreadfully and died shortly afterwards. This was the signal for a precipitate flight of the Pecherais. They no doubt entertained a fear that the French had cast a spell upon them, and that they would all die in a similar manner. End of Section 8. Recording by Malone.